Hello fellow adventurers and welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. This is a remake of the second episode that I ever filmed entitled Magic in the Air. So if you've been watching this channel from the very beginning, then you have already seen this episode, but again, I am remaking this to update it a little bit, taking some of your comments into account as always, and also adding my picture, as you can see up there in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. So that's going to be the new stuff that you're going to see on this remastered edition of Excursion 2, but other than that, it is going to be mostly the same content. So let's get started. Let's dive in. What is this particular episode about? It's going to be about magic, hence the title, but we're going to be diving into some particular scholarly questions about magic. Unfortunately, I am not going to be teaching you how to do magic in this safari. As many hits as I am sure I would get if I tried to do that, we're going to be a little bit more into the scholarly side of things here. So we're going to ask questions like, what is magic from an etymological perspective? In other words, where does this word and the concepts that come with this word, where does all that come from? What about words that might be associated with magic today? Words like wizards, witches, spells, enchantments, and maybe some of those nonsense words that we associate with magic today, such as abracadabra. Those are going to be the kind of things that we cover in this episode going forward. So let's get started and try to answer that first question first. What is magic? Where does this word and this concept come from? Now, I probably don't need to tell you that today we would say that magic is all over the world, and it's been all over the world for thousands of years. So when I say that we are tracing the roots of magic, I'm specifically talking about the word, not necessarily all the practices that we would call magic today, because again, those are widespread and certainly don't seem to have just come from one particular place. It seems like cultures have come up with these generally independently of each other. However, even though that's the case, most of these cultures haven't had a specific word for magic that necessarily equates to our modern word for magic and the word in lots of European and West Asian and North African languages today. And that's because our word and our modern Western concept for magic come from one particular place and time in world history, and they come out of a very specific geopolitical situation. So let's talk a little bit about what that geopolitical situation was that led to the birth of our modern term magic. It's going to help us understand quite a bit better why this term means what it does today. So if we go back to the 6th to 5th century BC, the Persian Empire was rapidly growing on the world scene. And by the end of the 500s BC, in other words, the 6th century BC, the Persian Empire had grown to be the largest empire that the world had known up until that point. You can see it on your map here, on the screen, on this map here on your screen, that it really covered all of the territory from what is now Egypt and what was already Egypt back then, all the way east to the Indian subcontinent, what is now Pakistan, Afghanistan, those areas. It also covered up into modern-day Turkey, pretty much all of modern-day Turkey, and then across the Hellespont Strait into what is now modern-day Greece. But as you can see from that green color where it says Greece on the map on your screen, the Persian Empire had not yet conquered Greece in the early 400s BC. In other words, when the 400s BC started, the 490s BC, that decade, the Persian Empire was expanding but had not yet conquered most of what we would today call Greece, except for the northeastern part of it. And as you can imagine, like most imperialist powers, the Persians decided to try to conquer the next thing in line, which unfortunately for the Greeks was them. The Persians, under two different kings, Darius and Xerxes, attempted and actually did invade Greece once in 490 BC, once in 480 BC, so these invasions were 10 years apart. And in both cases, the Greeks managed to band together and defeat the Persians and thus thwart their attempt at colonization, essentially, at annexing Greece into their giant world empire. As you can imagine, the Greeks were not happy about about trying to be annexed by the Persians through violence and military action. Most cultures wouldn't like this. So the Greeks did not have a great relationship with the Persians at this particular time period. However, it was a little bit more complicated than that, because I don't want to suggest that the Greeks just hated the Persians and wanted nothing to do with them, or just wanted to fight them and say bad things about them. On the other hand, the Greeks kind of had perhaps a grudging respect for the Persians and their culture at this time period. Even though they didn't like the fact that the Persians were, trying to invade them, they understood that the Persians were not only more powerful than them and wealthier than them, but also, and this is something that was important to the Greeks, also the Persians seemed to have a lot of knowledge about various things in the world that the Greeks didn't have. One of the reasons that the Persians had so much knowledge at this time period is because they had conquered and assimilated the two parts of the world that we would today call the Middle East, where culture had really come about at a very early time period. And if you know your ancient history, you know that those are Egypt in the southwestern corner of the map there, and Mesopotamia, which is the sort of middle part of the map where it says Assyria and Babylonia. So these cultures had been writing stuff down, thoughts about the world, observations about the world, for almost 3,000 years at this point in the middle of the 1st century BC, whereas the Greeks had only had the alphabet for a few hundred years at this point. So the Greeks realized that at the very least those two areas, Egypt and Mesopotamia, really were very advanced as far as the knowledge and learning that they had. And now that those were both incorporated into the Persian Empire, the Persians essentially had all of that knowledge for themselves. And so even though the Greeks didn't love the Persians politically, as we might say today, for some obvious reasons, they kind of looked up to the Persians when it came to epistemology. In other words, what they knew. And so the Greeks wanted to learn some of the things that the Persians knew, because knowledge is power, as we often say today. So there was kind of a fraught relationship between Greece and Persia. Once the second, and as it turned out, ultimately final Persian invasion of Greece failed in the years 480 to 479 BC, there kind of arose a tenuous peace between Greece and Persia. The Persians stopped invading after that. Again, there were still somewhat hostile relations between these two groups, but over the decades, as it became clear that Persia was probably not going to invade again, these two cultures, the Greeks and the Persians, and to be clear, the Persians were a big multi-ethnic empire made up of a bunch of cultures, but regardless, these two groups of cultures sort of settled into an uneasy peace where they became trading partners, and Greeks were able to go over to the Persian Empire and sell themselves out as mercenaries, which the Persians loved, because obviously the Greeks were very good warriors to be able to hold off the Persian Empire and their invasion not once, but twice. So there was a lot of knowledge that was being shared between Greece and Persia, and ultimately Greece was the beneficiary of that, because as we talked about, the Persians overall knew more than the Greeks at this time period, because the Persians were in control of these two areas of the world that had been just writing stuff down about their thoughts and observations of the world for so long. So the Greeks looked across this international boundary at the Persians with a mixture of distaste and fear on the one hand, and admiration and curiosity on the other. They learned about the Persian religion, which at that time period was a religion called Zoroastrianism. It still exists today. There are a few 100,000 Zoroastrians in the world. It is not a major world religion, but it does still exist today, and you can learn about it. It's pretty interesting. The name that the Persians gave to their priests, the priests in their official state religion of Zoroastrianism, was Magoosh, and that would be like a modern English spelling with that SH there. That's not quite how the Persians would have spelled it. The Persians didn't actually write in an alphabetic system at all, but that's neither here nor there. So the Persians called their priest Magoosh. That would have been the singular. So Magoosh was a Persian priest. Now, as far as we understand, if we're sort of trying to analyze what a Magoosh would do objectively from the perspective of a religious studies scholar, let's say, a Magoosh didn't seem to be that unusual if we're trying to compare all the different things that priests would do in all of the different cultures and religions of the world. Most of what we know about what a Magoosh would do comes from the Greek historian Herodotus. So on the one hand, maybe we should take it with a grain of salt because it was a Greek person telling us about what a Magoosh would do. On the other hand, Herodotus is trying to be objective, and he's trying to write a history of the Persians and an ethnography of the Persians and some other cultures. So Herodotus tells us that that if you were a Magoosh, you might be expected to perform sacrifices, perform libations, which are basically liquid sacrifices of some kind, and do funeral rituals. So, as you probably know, none of those things are objectively weird for a priest to do. Even today, in many Western cultures, right? Priests might do some kind of, maybe not sacrifice anymore, animal sacrifice, but if you're a Catholic priest, you might do something involving the body and blood of Christ that is representative of a sacrifice, and you'll certainly, of course, give last rites or whatever. So, generally speaking, overarchingly, the priests that were called a Magoosh in Persian culture, they weren't that unusual. They weren't that weird. They did some things that the Greeks thought were weird, but generally speaking, they weren't that strange. However, once again, the Greeks looked at these people and they said, they are different than us, all right, but they are going to be doing some things that are similar to us, all right? And so they ultimately came to have a particular viewpoint of these particular people, which we are about to talk about shortly. However, when it comes to the word Magoosh, in other words, the linguistic root that Magoosh comes from, there wasn't actually anything particularly unusual about that root either, because it really just comes from an ancient Indo-European root that means to be capable or to be powerful. Persian, Old Persian, which was the language of the Persian Empire at that time period, was an Indo-European language. It descended linguistically from the Proto-Indo-Europeans who lived out on the steppes of what is now Ukraine and Russia, at least that's our best guess, about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. And many cultures and languages of the world descend from the Proto-Indo-Europeans, including Persian, and as it turns out, English. So we have some words in English that also come from the same Indo-European root, just to help you kind of make connections here and see what this root meant. Because it really just meant, again, to be capable or powerful, and we get words like might in English from this same root. So the noun might means capability or power, and the verb might, which is also from the same root, means that you could do that. You have the power to do that. Maybe you will, maybe you won't, but you are able to. And by the way, our word may, our verb may, not the month, but the verb may, like I may do something, also comes from this root as well. So as you can see, a Persian Magoosh really in the Old Persian language didn't mean anything fancy. It just meant somebody who had power, which if you think about it, is not a bad word for a priest. If you were just going to come up with a word for a priest in a particular culture, then you also might just come up with a word that meant powerful person or person who has power or something like that. Now, you may have heard of these Magoosh people in another context, and that is because they do occur in the Bible, specifically the New Testament. There are these people who come from the east of Bethlehem to visit the baby Jesus, and they are called in Greek Magos, or the plural would be Magoi in Greek, and then the Latinized version of Magoi is, we would pronounce it today as Magi. So you may have heard of the Magi. They are these wise men. Oftentimes they're just translated or rendered as wise men. Again, they come from the east. They come from what is now Babylonia, or what was then and now Babylonia and Persia. And so they are represented as being some kind of descendants of this Magoosh tradition. And maybe actually each of them was a Magoosh himself. So you know about these people. You have heard of them in another context if you know anything about the Christmas story at least. And that story definitely plays on some of these traditions about the Persian religion that we are talking about here. However, as I mentioned, the Greeks were looking across this international boundary, fraught as it was with political and military and ethnic tension. And they heard about these magoi, as they would have said, and they borrowed this word into Greek as just magos, so they didn't really change it much. Again, magos is the singular, magoi would have been the plural, and magi is the modern Latin equivalent that we usually use. So they heard about the Magoi, and they agreed, yeah, they are really powerful people. We should respect them in some way. They probably know something that we don't. As I mentioned, this was common for the Greeks to look at the Persians and respect them for their increased knowledge. However, However, the Greeks also thought that maybe the Magoi were strange, maybe the Magoi were weird, maybe they were doing some things that the Greeks considered weird to them, and this would hardly be the first time that one ethnicity looked at another ethnicity and thought, we can respect them for some things, but we're not going to respect them for everything because we think they're weird and we think we're right. And so it seems like that was the attitude that the Greeks ultimately had toward the Magoi. Powerful, but weird. So they borrow the word magos or magoi essentially into Greek, and then they form an adjective, what was originally an adjective, off of magoi, and that was magike. The ik is just an adjective ending in Greek, and then they put another ending on it. That's where you get magike from. So the fundamental etymological meaning of the word magike was just something having to do with the magoi. That's actually all it originally meant, but then it rapidly came to develop other connotations as well, and it started to be used as a substantivized adjective. In other words, a noun. Even though it was originally an adjective, it came to be a noun that we can just translate as magic, essentially, and you can see you can get the word magic directly from it, and our word magic comes from this Greek word through Latin, which is why the K got changed to a C. So this Greek word magike really just meant, for them, originally it would have been a term meaning anything that a Magoosh would do, but since they were looking across this ethnic and political boundary and thinking that the Magoosh people were a little bit weird, even if they were powerful, the way that they came to use this word magike was anything that's related to something that is vaguely religious or supernatural, and that's a big sphere, obviously, but which the speaker thinks is weird or abnormal. So maybe it's something, if we were going to define it today, it's something another religion would do, but not the religion in our culture, okay? It's something that another culture might do. We might think it's real, we might think it's powerful, maybe not, but either way, we do think that it's strange from the perspective of our culture where we are standing. And that is really the birth of the term magic, and that is really the birth of the concept magic. It originally just referred to something that would be considered strange from the perspective of the speaker, but quite possibly still powerful. Just because something is strange doesn't mean it's necessarily fake, right? And again, the Greeks really did respect the Persians, so you can see why they wouldn't necessarily have thought that these people were all charlatans or fakes, but maybe they could be, because you don't really know where they're getting their power from. So rapidly, this term came to be a possible insult. You could insult somebody in Greek culture who was not a Persian or a Magoosh at all for doing magike, and you might be implying that they're fake, or maybe you just might be implying that they're weird. Either way, it's an insult, and that is how the word magic ultimately came into being. So it comes from this particular context, this particular historical geopolitical context. That's really where our word magic comes from. Let's talk about some specific words and terms and phrases that we might lump together with magic today, and within that general envelope and under that umbrella. How about incantations and enchantments? I'm putting these both on the same slide and discussing them at the same time because they actually come from the same root, and that's actually because enchantment is just a later version of incantation. We'll talk about that here in a second. So incantation comes from a Latin word that is made up of several parts. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that we like to break up words and see what they mean, because then they tend to make more sense once you can see what each individual part means. Incantation is no different, because incantation is a Latin term that is made up of three parts. In, which means in, obviously, or into, or onto, or sometimes against, if it's in like a hostile sense, which it might be here. And then the root cant, C-A-N-T there, as you can see, this root in Latin meant to sing, but I want to make clear that in the ancient Mediterranean languages, including Latin, their words that meant to sing were a little bit bigger than our idea of singing today. They could mean to sing without music, and of course we can still do that, but they can mean to chant in the sense that if you're chanting something, there's some kind of rhythm and maybe meter to it. They would use that same word for any of those kind of verbal activities that have some kind of rhythm or meter, even if they wouldn't necessarily fall under the rubric of what we would call singing, strictly speaking, today. So I just want to make clear that this is a general term. I also want to make clear that the Romans were translating a Greek phrase here because the original word or phrase that the Romans were translating into Latin from Greek was epaoide in Greek, and epi means onto or upon, and aoide means a song. So an epaoide was the original incantation, and it actually just meant the same thing this did. It was a singing or a chanting or a reciting at something or against something if it's in a hostile sense. So as you can see, when you break down the word, it doesn't necessarily sound magical in the modern sense. It's a fairly banal word, and we're going to see that this is a theme as we go through a lot of these terms, that these terms didn't originally mean anything super magical. Kind of like the word magake didn't necessarily start by meaning something magical. It was just from a Persian priest, and then it got interpreted a little bit differently. So also this word, incantation, didn't necessarily start out being something that we would necessarily call magical today. Maybe, maybe not. The lines are definitely blurry, but then it has come to be something that, if you hear somebody say they're doing an incantation, that's going to sound very magical to you today. So when we go back to the original Latin and Greek vocabulary, oftentimes we demystify it a little bit and we understand better what was going through their heads when they heard these words and used them with each other. So originally, an incantation is just when you sing or chant something at somebody or at something. It doesn't necessarily have to be hostile, but it can be hostile because that is one of the meanings of that Latin preposition in. I mentioned that enchantment goes here too, and that's because enchantment is actually just the French version of the Latin incantation. French evolved from Latin. It's a Romance language, and so basically they took all the Latin words, and over the centuries those words evolved a little bit. They started to sound a little bit different. So the Latin preposition in became en or en in French. We just say enchantment in English, but that's not how you would say it in French today, of course. And then the Latin root cant that meant to sing actually just evolved into chant, which we actually borrowed that word directly from French into English as our word chant. So our word chant comes from French and ultimately from Latin, the cant root, okay? But the reason that H is in there and we pronounce it a little bit differently than Latin did is because of the French influence, but it's still essentially the same word. So literally, an enchantment is the same thing. It is a singing against or a singing onto or singing into. The words change their phonetic representation a little bit. Enchantment instead of incantation. Obviously, the suffix is different, the noun suffix there in Latin and French, but we don't need to worry too much about that because that's not really going to impact the word too much. But regardless, you can see that the meaning hasn't changed much, even if the sound of these words has changed a little bit. Interestingly, when we say that something is enchanting, or there's an enchantment, or if you feel enchanted by something, you're probably not literally saying that someone has pronounced an incantation against you, but you may nonetheless be saying that you feel some magic. Right? You feel some kind of magical sentiment about something if you are feeling enchanted by a particular person or a particular experience. So you can see that the semantics have evolved further to not necessarily imply that there has been an actual incantation that has been performed against you, but you feel as though maybe somebody performed an incantation against you, which might explain why you feel the way you do about them or about the thing that you're enchanted by. So it's interesting to follow these semantic evolutions. What about the word potion? Again, the word potion, pretty popular in magical literature and fictional magical literature, perhaps like the Harry Potter series. But when we actually look at the etymological root of the word potion, kind of like on the last slide, we find out that it doesn't really come from anything that sounds that magical. It's pretty banal originally. A potion actually just meant a drink in Latin. It comes from the Latin noun potio, basically exactly like potion, which in turn just comes from the Latin root pot, which meant to drink, or as an adjective, it could be drinkable. So if something is potable, we have this word in English today. You probably know that if your water is potable, which hopefully it is, if you're going to drink it, it means that it is drinkable. Potable means drinkable. And so you can see that a potion really just means a drink. Obviously, that's not necessarily how we would use the word today in modern English. You probably don't go around telling people that your milk or your soda or whatever it is you're drinking is a potion, although now that you know that's the root, try that with your friends and let me know how it goes, because I'm sure it would be an interesting sociological experiment. Let's keep going and talk about another thing that we associate, broadly speaking, with magic today, and that is spells. The word spell does not come from Greek or Latin. Unlike the past several slides, it actually is a native English word that descends from an Old English word that was just spell, and that word was very simple. Again, that was not a magical word either. It literally just meant something spoken or something narrated. So originally a spell was just something that you said, which probably wouldn't be magical or intended to be magical on a daily basis if you just say a lot of things, obviously. But then it came to have a more specific magical meaning of saying something that had some kind of magical content that might be an incantation or something like that. One place in the English language where we still have the word spell hiding, where it's definitely not intended to be magical at all, is the word gospel. The word gospel was originally a translation of the Greek word euangelion, which is Greek for good news. That's all it means. Eo means good, angelion means news or message. It's the same root as angel because angel just means messenger in ancient Greek, and that's a translation of the original Hebrew word malak. So the Evangelion in Greek is the content of the Christian message, as it's called in the New Testament. And when the Bible was translated from Greek into Old English, they tried to translate that term Evangelion as clearly as possible, and they literally just translated it the Godspell, and then they ran those two words together into gospel, which we pronounce gospel today. Gospel just means good news, but it comes from Old English, God, which is good. We still have that word today, and it hasn't changed much. But then the second part of it, spell, we still have today, but that word has changed a lot. We would not today say that if you're reading from the New Testament, you are trying to cast a spell on somebody, but that word is right there in the word gospel because that was not the original meaning of the word spell. It didn't necessarily mean something magical. It just meant a message or a narrative or a story or something spoken, and that's really all it originally meant. What about some kinds of people whom we sort of stereotypically think of as practicing magic today? What about a wizard? We like to throw the word wizard around. Wizards are popular characters in many of our fantasy universes that we enjoy visiting. The word wizard comes from an Old English root. Again, this is also not something that we borrowed from Greek or Latin. It's part of our native English and Germanic inheritance. It comes from this Old English root that could be wit or wis, depending on the context. And the fundamental meaning of this root basically means knowledge. We have actually talked about this root elsewhere on a different safari, so I'm going to put a link up here if you want to check out more about this root. So we get a lot of words from this root. So for instance, wit, if you are witty, today that means you're funny, not necessarily knowledgeable, but originally it would have meant you're knowledgeable. And of course we do know that there is some kind of connection between humor and intelligence in humans as a general rule. But the word wit still maintains its original, meaning of knowledge in a phrase like witless. If you are witless, it doesn't mean you're not funny. It means that you're not knowledgeable, and not necessarily in a book sense, but you're dumb. You don't have common sense. Maybe you're just not paying attention to things. That's kind of what it means to be witless. Of course, we still have words like wise and wisdom today in English that have the wis root instead of the wit root, but again, it's the same root, and wise and wisdom both obviously have something to do with knowledge and being able to deploy it and use it. So the original meaning of the word wizard actually just meant knowledgeable guy, knowledgeable person. That's really all it meant. Again, it didn't necessarily have to be magical, but then the semantics evolved to the point where it was someone who is specifically knowledgeable about things that maybe most people, your average person, wouldn't necessarily be knowledgeable about, including magic, broadly construed. So you can see how that might have evolved in that direction, as it in fact did. What about witches? Witches, there's a little bit of controversy about what this root comes from. Some people have said that it actually comes from the same root as the last slide, and it means like knowledgeable person. That's not impossible, but the best guess we have is that it actually comes from a somewhat different Old English root, which again may ultimately be connected back to the wit or the wis root. And this English root, or really word, was wicca, which meant something like sorcerer. So this may have actually been a bit more magical sounding if we go all the way back to Old English. Now, in Old English, this would have been connected originally to words that meant divine, so it may have been someone who was thought to have a special relationship with the divine sphere or with the gods in a polytheistic system, or maybe with God in the Judeo-Christian system, or maybe outside of the Judeo-Christian system altogether. Either way, that seems to be our best guess as to the etymology of the word witch. Interestingly, in Old English, this was not a gender-specific term. So even though today, in English, if you went and asked most people whether the word witch was gendered, most people would probably tell you yes, that it makes them think of someone feminine instead of someone masculine. I realize that's not true for everybody, but I'm sort of just talking about if you did a poll and tried to figure out what most people think. But originally, in Old English, this was not a gendered word. There could be male witches and female witches if you put the appropriate masculine or feminine noun ending on in Old English. And I probably don't need to tell you that there is a modern movement called Wiccans who got their name essentially all the way back from this Old English word, and it's not gender specific in that group today. So in that sense, they are hearkening back to the Old English way of looking at this word and doing things. Let's finish the safari by talking about some of these magical words. In other words, words that seem like they might be nonsense words, but that we sort of stereotypically use in magical contexts, or we read about people stereotypically using in magical contexts. I want to warn you that these words are specifically quite difficult to trace. One of them is because they look like nonsense words, and so they're supposed to be mysterious, right? Like the whole point of these words, or at least a lot of the point of these words, is that you're not supposed to know exactly what it means or where it comes from, other than it's just something magical and it might have some efficacious power to it. So what we're talking about on this slide is going to be less sure than normal. Usually if there's something that we really just don't know about, I might just not include it at all, but you know what? That would not be fun if I didn't include these words on this particular safari. So let's talk about some of these words. One interesting point is that to the extent we can trace these words, they oftentimes seem to go back to the classical Greco-Roman era. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them do. And that is because in the Greco-Roman era, people who were doing what we might call magic and what they might call magic would oftentimes use words from other cultures of the area. And oftentimes not just any words, but oftentimes those would be words of gods or spirits or divinities from a particular culture. They might not be your culture gods or divinities, but in a polytheistic system, it was pretty normal to believe that other cultures' gods really existed, even if you didn't necessarily worship them or know about them. And so maybe you could bring them in to whatever you were doing and call on them, and maybe they would listen, and if not, it couldn't hurt to try. So it seems like a lot of these magical words do come from the names of gods in particular cultures of the ancient Mediterranean and ancient Near East, what we would basically today call the Middle East. So that's actually the most promising avenue to try to figure out where some of these words come from. This is definitely true with the word or phrase, whatever you want to call it, abracadabra. This is obviously a famous magic phrase today that in English and in most languages doesn't really make any sense. It's just something you say when you want to, sound like you're doing something magical or making something happen or whatever. Now, you can search the internet and find a lot of different theories on this particular word. Let me just say that the only people who are definitely wrong are the ones who claim they know for sure where it's from. I'm not going to claim I know for sure where it's from because nobody does. And so again, the only ones who are wrong for sure are the ones who think they definitely know where it is from. There are some good theories. One of the good theories, I think, is that it comes from ancient Hebrew or Aramaic, and it could be interpreted as an ancient Hebrew or Aramaic phrase that has something to do with creating as spoken or something to that effect. It doesn't quite exactly match up, but it could be from ancient Hebrew or Aramaic. I don't think that's an unreasonable theory. I also don't think it's definitely proven by any stretch of the imagination. For my money, I think it might be a little bit more likely, again, not to impugn that theory, but it might be a little bit more likely that it comes from the name of an ancient Egyptian god, Abraxas. Sometimes his name was written and pronounced Abrasax. Again, the reason I think that this might be the leader in the clubhouse as far as what theory might be the most likely for where this word comes from or this magical phrase comes from is because, again, a lot of these magical phrases, especially the ones that go back to the classical Greco-Roman era, do have their origins in the name of some god that is not Greek or Roman, but maybe Egyptian or Babylonian or from some other culture. And that's exactly what Abraxas or Abrasax is. If you read a lot of ancient curses and spells from that era, they call on Abraxas or Abrasax quite a bit, even if they're not Egyptian and they don't personally worship him. So I think that the phrase abracadabra today, I guess that's not how we would say it, abracadabra today in modern English, may well ultimately come from the name of this ancient Egyptian god. However, just to be clear, I would not go to Las Vegas and put down any money on this because I don't think we know for sure. What about hocus pocus? Hocus pocus is another one of these magical phrases that sounds kind of like a nonsense phrase in English today, but it may ultimately come from something that might have made sense at one point. Once again, I'm not saying that I'm definitely agreeing with this theory. I think this is probably the most likely theory, but most likely does not necessarily mean correct. So take it with a grain of salt. You can notice that the words hocus pocus on themselves don't mean anything, but it has often been noticed by many people that they look suspiciously like the phrase hoc est corpus, which is a Latin phrase that means this is the body. Now, where would somebody say, or in what context would somebody say in Latin, this is the body, or something like that? If you are a priest, a Catholic priest speaking Latin in the Mass, which all Catholic priests did up until the 1960s, and this phrase is obviously much older than the 1960s, you would say something like this, maybe not these exact words, but something like this at some point when you are conducting the Mass, maybe at the point where you are handing out the bread that represents the body of Christ and the wine that represents the blood of Christ, all right? And so it may be that this hocus pocus phrase was meant to be a mangling of these Latin words hoc est corpus. Some people think that it may have been made up by Protestants to even make fun of that Catholic saying in the Latin Mass, hoc est corpus, to try to show that maybe the Protestants didn't really think that it had the power that the Catholic priests thought it did. We're not going to get into the weeds of Catholic versus Protestant Christian theology here, but let's just say that there may have been some reasons that Protestants may have wanted to make fun of, the Catholic Mass at that particular point because there were differences in their theology. Again, I would not say that we're sure of this. I would not say that I am sure of this. I think there's definitely room for alternate theories on this, but it seems to me that this is the best guess, that this was originally from this Latin phrase in one way or another. And again, even if you buy that it's from this Latin phrase, there are multiple avenues toward getting back to how it might originally have been from this Latin phrase. All right. That's our episode. That's our safari. We've gone through a lot of magical words. We've learned where the word magic comes from and the particular context in world history that it comes from. It's cool to know history because it really helps you put everything in perspective. If you have any questions or comments, more than all the great comments that you left me the last time that I posted this video, please go ahead and comment below. We'll see you next time.